The sister Kusham from Chittagong has asked this question, and she has basically asked 4 questions, and all of them are related to science. And I'll answer one question at a time. The first question is that Quran says that sun and moon moves around in their own orbit, but why Quran does not say anywhere that earth also moves around the sun? Let me remind you, and I've mentioned this in the beginning of my talk on the Quran and modern science, compatible or incompatible. And I said this, that the Quran is not a book of science, S-C-I-E-N-C-E, but it's a book of signs. It's a book of ayats, S-I-G-N-S. And in the Quran, there are more than 6,000 signs. There are more than 6,000 ayats, out of which more than 1,000 speak about science, S-C-I-E-N-C. So let me remind you that the Quran is not a book of science, S-C-I-E-N-C, but it's a book of signs, S-I-G-N-S. So you asked in the first question that the Quran mentions that the sun and the moon, it revolves. What you're referring to is the verse of the Quran of Surah Anbiya, chapter number 21, verse number 33, where it says that هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ اللَّيْلَ وَالنَّهَارَ. It's Allah who has created the night and the day. وَالشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ, the sun and the moon. كُلٌّ فِي فَلْكِ يَسْبَحُونَ, each one traveling in the orbit with its own motion. Here the Arabic word yasbahun refers to the motion of a moving body. So when it's talking about a celestial body, it does not mean that it is just flying, it means it is rotating about its own axis. Allah has created the night and the day, the sun and the moon, each one traveling in orbit with its own motion. So the first motion is talking about the revolution, talking about that the sun and the moon are revolving. And yasbahun means it is rotating about its own axis. So in this verse, the Quran says the sun, besides revolving, even rotates about its own axis. And this science has proved recently when I was in school, when I passed my school in the 1982. I did not know about this, we were not taught, but now we know that the sun, besides revolving, even rotates about its own axis. The question poses that why doesn't the Quran say that the earth revolves around the sun, that the earth moves around the sun? As I told you, that Quran is not a book of science. So everything of science is not mentioned in the Quran. Tomorrow you'll ask me that why doesn't the Quran say 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? Everyone knows, any child who passes from school or even is in the 2nd grade or 3rd grade, he knows very well that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. So if he asks me, why doesn't the Quran say 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? Because Quran is not a book of mathematics. Quran is not a book of science. So it's an absurd question you're asking, that imagine if the Quran had to mention every scientific fact, it would have been a voluminous, or rather a library which would require, I don't know, hundreds of floors only to mention the scientific facts, because there are millions of scientific facts. What I say in my talk, that there is not a single verse in the Quran which goes against established scientific fact. So that makes it the word of God. Whereas the other scriptures, if you put the test of science to it, there may be some verses which may match with scientific fact, but there are many verses which are against science. So what I say in this talk of mine, Quran and modern science, compatible or incompatible, I say that more than 1,000 verses of the Quran speak about science, and there is not a single verse in the Quran which goes against established science. I never claim that every scientific fact is mentioned in the Quran. Otherwise it would be a book so voluminous. It would be like, this book, most of the human beings don't read it because they think it's vast. Imagine if all scientific facts were mentioned in the Quran, it would be hundreds of times more voluminous.